Hi, I'm Natalie, and my mother-in-law didn't just call me a worthless gold digger at my own engagement party. She made sure everyone in Portland's elite social circle knew exactly what she thought of me. She orchestrated my public humiliation with surgical precision, watched me crumble under the weight of her words, and smiled as she destroyed every professional connection I'd spent years building. But what Victoria Hawthorne didn't know was that the quiet girl she dismissed as beneath her family's standards had been quietly building an empire while she was busy tearing me down. She thought money was power until I bought her son's company right out from under her perfectly manicured fingernails. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The champagne flute trembled in my hand as I stood in the corner of the Cascade Hills Country Club ballroom, watching Portland's most influential families mingle around tables draped in ivory silk. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors that had witnessed decades of power plays, disguised as social gatherings. My engagement ring caught the light, a modest but beautiful piece that Marcus had chosen with such care, but tonight it felt heavy against my finger like a target marking me as an outsider. I smoothed down the navy dress I'd bought on sale 3 months ago, the same one I'd worn to 2 other events, because it was the only formal piece in my wardrobe that didn't scream struggling graduate student. Around me, women glided in designer gowns that cost more than my yearly rent, their jewelry sparkling with the confidence that came from inherited wealth and unquestioned social position. I reminded myself that I belonged here, that Marcus loved me, that his family would eventually see past their initial reservations. Then Victoria Hawthorne swept into the room like a storm front moving across the Columbia River. She wore a stunning emerald gown that complemented her silver hair, styled in an elegant chignon that probably cost more than my monthly food budget. Her presence commanded immediate attention, conversations pausing as heads turned to acknowledge Portland's reigning queen of high society. Behind her walked Richard, her husband, distinguished in his tailored tuxedo, but clearly playing the supporting role he'd perfected over 30 years of marriage to a woman who treated social hierarchy like a chess game she'd never lost. Victoria's eyes found mine across the room, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite a frown, but something colder, more calculating. She approached with the measured steps of someone who'd choreographed this moment in her mind long before arriving. Marcus appeared at my side, his hand finding the small of my back with a gentle touch that usually steadied me. Tonight, it felt like an anchor trying to hold me in place against an incoming tide. "Mother," he said warmly, leaning down to kiss Victoria's cheek, "you look stunning tonight." "Thank you, darling." Her voice carried the refined accent she'd cultivated through years of elocution lessons and carefully chosen social circles. "And Natalie," she turned to me with a smile that never reached her eyes, "how lovely that you could make it to your own engagement celebration." The comment landed with surgical precision. Of course I would be at my own engagement party, but the way she said it suggested I was an unexpected guest rather than the guest of honor, someone who'd wandered into a gathering meant for people of actual importance. "Thank you for hosting this beautiful evening, Mrs. Hawthorne," I replied, keeping my voice steady, despite the tightness growing in my chest. "The club looks absolutely magical tonight." "Oh please," she laughed, the sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. "Call me Victoria. After all, we're practically family now." The word practically hung in the air like a qualification, a reminder that nothing was permanent, that acceptance was conditional and could be revoked at any moment. Marcus squeezed my hand, oblivious to the undercurrent of hostility flowing between his mother and me. "Natalie's been looking forward to this all week," he said with the genuine enthusiasm that had made me fall in love with him. "She even took time off from her thesis research to help with the planning." Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. Thesis research. How admirable. The way she pronounced it made graduate school sound like an extended hobby rather than the foundation of a career I'd been building since undergraduate school. "And what exactly are you studying again, dear?" "Urban development and sustainable architecture," I said, straightening my shoulder. "I'm focusing on how mixed-income housing can revitalize downtown areas while preserving community character." "How wonderfully idealistic," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting that idealism was a luxury reserved for people who'd never faced real responsibility. "Marcus's father and I have always believed in practical approaches to real estate development. Haven't we, Richard?" Richard nodded automatically, clearly accustomed to agreeing with whatever position Victoria staked out. Absolutely, market forces tend to sort these things out naturally. I opened my mouth to explain that my research was actually quite practical, backed by economic data and successful case studies from cities across the Pacific Northwest. But Victoria had already turned her attention back to Marcus. Darling, I need to introduce you to the Washington. Diana's daughter just returned from her year abroad in Switzerland, and she's joining her father's investment firm. Such an accomplished young woman. The message was crystal clear. There were accomplished young women in their social circle, women with the right education, the right connections, the right background. Women who belonged in rooms like this without having to explain themselves or justify their presence. As Victoria led Marcus away toward a cluster of well-dressed couples near the orchestra, I found myself alone again, clutching my champagne flute like a lifeline. The bubbles had gone flat while I'd been talking, leaving the drink as tasteless as my confidence felt in that moment. Quite the interrogation, a voice said beside me. I turned to see a woman about my age, her auburn hair styled in loose waves and her green eyes sparkling with what looked like genuine amusement rather than malice. I'm Sophia Chen, by the way. I work in marketing for a sustainable design firm downtown. Natalie Brooks, I replied, grateful for a friendly face. And yeah, I'm starting to understand why Marcus warned me about family gatherings. Sophia laughed, a warm sound that cut through the ambient tension I'd been carrying. Victoria Hawthorne is legendary in Portland's architecture and development circles. She's been the unofficial gatekeeper for major projects in this city for over 2 decades. If she likes you, doors open. If she doesn't, she gestured vaguely around the opulent ballroom. Well, let's just say it's better to stay on her good side. My stomach dropped slightly. I'd known the Hawthorne family was influential in Portland's real estate world, but I hadn't fully grasped the extent of Victoria's reach into the professional community I hoped to join after graduation. Marcus had mentioned his mother's involvement in various civic organizations and charity boards, but he'd presented it as community service rather than empire building. She seems to think I'm not quite the right fit for Marcus, I admitted, watching as Victoria gestured animatedly while talking to a distinguished older man I recognized as the mayor. The right fit for Marcus, or the right fit for the Hawthorne legacy? Sophia asked perceptively. There's a difference. Victoria's not just protecting her son, she's protecting a brand that's taken her decades to build. Before I could respond, the orchestra finished their current piece, and the bandleader stepped forward to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Hawthorne would like to say a few words about this evening's celebration. The room quieted as Victoria and Richard moved to the small stage area near the orchestra. Victoria took the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd delivered countless speeches at similar gatherings, her posture perfect and her smile radiant under the spotlight. Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate what should be one of the happiest occasions in any family's life, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's acoustic. When a child finds love and decides to build a future with someone special, it represents hope for the next generation and the continuation of values we hold dear. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. I smiled and moved closer to the stage, assuming this was the moment when Victoria would formally welcome me into the family and express her joy about Marcus's choice of partner. Marcus has always been our pride and joy, Victoria continued, her eyes finding her son in the crowd. A graduate of Stanford Business School, a leader in Portland's business community, and someone who understands the responsibility that comes with privilege. He's had opportunities to pursue relationships with many remarkable young women over the years, women who share our family's commitment to excellence and community leadership. My smile began to falter as I realized the direction this speech was taking. Around me, guests were nodding approvingly, some glancing in my direction with expressions that ranged from curious to sympathetic. Tonight, we're here to celebrate Marcus's engagement to Natalie Brooks, Victoria said, gesturing toward me with a wave that felt more like identification in a police lineup than recognition at a celebration. A charming girl who's certainly captured our son's heart with earnestness and determination. The pause before earnestness was deliberate, loaded with implication. In Victoria's social lexicon, earnestness was not a compliment, It suggested someone who tried too hard, who lacked the natural grace that came from being born into the right circumstance. Of course, blending families from different backgrounds always presents interesting challenges, she continued, her voice maintaining its warm tone while delivering what felt like surgical strikes. We've learned so much about perspectives we might not have encountered otherwise. It's been quite educational, really. The word educational landed like a physical blow. She was turning my presence in their family into a learning experience, a case study in cross-cultural relations. I wasn't a daughter-in-law to be embraced. I was an anthropological curiosity to be observed and discussed. We're confident that love will find a way to bridge any gaps in experience or expectation, Victoria said, raising her champagne flute. After all, Marcus has always been drawn to projects that require patience and careful guidance. To the happy couple, and to the journey ahead of them, the room erupted in applause and raised glasses, but the words hit me like ice water. Victoria had just compared me to a project, something requiring patience and guidance, in front of Portland's most influential families. She'd positioned herself as the wise mentor who would help transform her son's misguided choice into something acceptable. I raised my own glass automatically, muscle memory taking over while my mind struggled to process what had just happened. Beside me, Sophia's expression had gone carefully neutral, the kind of diplomatic blank face people wore when witnessing someone else's humiliation in a social setting. Marcus appeared at my side, his arm wrapping around my waist as he pulled me close for what should have been a romantic moment. "Wasn't that wonderful?" he said, his voice full of genuine happiness. "I know Mother was nervous about speaking tonight, but she did beautifully." I nodded wordlessly, unable to trust my voice. Marcus had heard an entirely different speech than I had, filtering his mother's words through decades of love and respect rather than the cold analysis of someone being systematically excluded from a family circle. "She's so happy about our engagement," he continued, completely missing the undercurrents that had left me feeling like I'd been flayed alive in front of a room full of strangers. "I told you she'd come around once she got to know you better." The receiving line formed naturally as guests approached to offer congratulations and share in what was supposed to be our joy. One by one, Portland's elite filed past, offering polite smiles and carefully worded well wishes that felt more like condolences than celebration. "Such an interesting match," one woman murmured, air-kissing my cheeks with the efficiency of someone performing an obligation. "Marcus always was drawn to unique situations. How refreshing to see young love crossing social boundaries," another guest offered, her tone suggesting that refreshing was synonymous with naive. The mayor's wife paused longer than most, studying me with the keen interest of someone evaluating a potential political liability. "I understand you're studying urban development," she said. "How nice that you're interested in improving communities. We always need people willing to help from the ground level. Not leadership level, not policy level, but ground level where the real work happened and the real decisions were made by people like her." Diana Walsh, Victoria's closest friend and social co-conspirator, approached with the predatory grace of someone who'd been waiting for this moment all evening. "Natalie, darling," she said, her voice dripping with false warmth, "Victoria has told me so much about you. A graduate student, isn't that ambitious? I suppose not everyone can be fortunate enough to focus on family and community involvement right away." The implication was clear. While I was playing at being a student, women of my age in their social circle were already establishing themselves as wives, mothers, and community leaders. I was pursuing selfish academic goals instead of contributing to society in ways they considered meaningful. "Actually," I began, trying to find my footing in this conversational minefield, "my research focuses on how thoughtful development can strengthen communities while creating economic opportunities for residents across income levels." Diana's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew sharper. "How lovely that you want to help people." Victoria mentioned you grew up in a more modest circumstances. "It must give you such insight into what those communities really need." The words were perfectly polite, completely appropriate for a social gathering, and absolutely devastating in their precision. Diana had just reminded everyone within earshot, that I came from modest circumstances, implying that my perspective was valuable only as a representative voice from the lower classes, rather than as an educated professional with expertise worth respecting. "Excuse me," I said quietly, placing my barely touched champagne flute on a nearby table. "I need to step outside for some air." I walked as calmly as possible toward the French doors leading to the club's terrace, my heels clicking against marble with what felt like thunderous volume. Behind me, conversations resumed with the relieved energy of people who'd just witnessed an uncomfortable scene and were eager to move past it. The October evening air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of falling leaves from the oak trees that lined the club's manicured ground. Portland's skyline glittered in the distance, the city lights reflecting off the Willamette River like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful and peaceful, everything the ballroom had failed to be. I gripped the stone balustrade and tried to steady my breathing. This was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life, the moment when Marcus's family officially welcomed me into their circle and we began planning a future together. Instead, I felt like I'd been put on trial and found guilty of the crime of not being born into the right family. My phone buzzed with a text message. I pulled it from my small clutch purse, hoping it might be a friend checking in or even a distraction from work. Instead, it was from my graduate advisor, Professor Martinez. "Heard through the grapevine that Victoria Hawthorne was asking questions about your research and academic standing. Thought you should know. Hope all is well." My hands went cold despite the evening's mild temperature. Victoria had been investigating me, checking on my academic credentials, and probably looking for ammunition to use in conversations like the one I'd just endured. The realization that she'd been actively working to undermine me while maintaining her facade of polite acceptance hit like a physical blow. I leaned against the balustrade and stared out at the city where I'd been trying to build a life and career. Somewhere out there were the neighborhoods I'd been studying, communities where people worked multiple jobs to afford rent, and still found ways to support each other through difficult times. Those people understood struggle and resilience in ways that the guests inside the ballroom never would. But those people also didn't have the power to blacklist me from every major development project in the city, something Victoria Hawthorne absolutely could do if she decided I was a threat to her family's reputation. The French doors opened behind me, and I turned expecting to see Marcus coming to check on me. Instead, Victoria stepped onto the terrace, her emerald gown rustling softly in the evening breeze. She'd wrapped a cashmere shawl around her shoulders and carried herself with the same regal bearing she'd displayed all evening. "I thought we should have a private conversation," she said, her voice losing the warm public tone and becoming something cooler, more direct. Woman to woman, without Marcus hovering nearby with his romantic notions about love conquering all. I straightened my spine and turned to face her fully. "I'm listening." Victoria moved to stand beside me at the balustrade, her gaze following mine out toward the city skyline. "You seem like a nice enough girl, Natalie. Hard-working, dedicated to your studies, genuinely fond of my son. I can see why Marcus is attracted to you." She paused, letting the compliment settle before delivering what I sensed would be a devastating follow-up. "But fondness isn't enough to build a marriage that will last, especially when that marriage involves responsibilities and expectations you couldn't possibly understand." Her voice remained conversational, almost maternal. "Marcus will inherit significant business interests and social obligations. He'll need a partner who can navigate those waters without constant guidance and support." "I'm not asking for constant guidance," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "I'm building my own career and expertise. I have plenty to contribute to a marriage beyond just social connections." Victoria smiled, the expression both pitying and predatory. "Of course you believe that, but believing something and having the world acknowledge it are two very different things. You've spent this evening watching how people respond to you, haven't you? Seeing the polite smiles that don't quite reach their eyes, hearing the careful phrasing that sounds supportive but actually isolates you." She was right, and we both knew it. Every conversation had felt like walking through a minefield. Every interaction, a reminder that I didn't belong in this world despite my engagement ring, and my invitation to be here. "That's not about my worth as a person," I said. "That's about their prejudices and assumptions." "Perhaps," Victoria conceded, But those prejudices and assumptions control major decisions in this city: development projects, funding approvals, partnership opportunities, academic positions. They all flow through networks you're not part of, and probably never will be. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Cross Victoria Hawthorne, and doors would close throughout Portland's professional community. She didn't need to say it directly, the power dynamic was clear enough. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I asked. Victoria turned to face me directly, her expression becoming almost gentle. "I'm asking you to think carefully about whether you really want to spend your life fighting for acceptance in a world that will always see you as an outsider. I'm asking you to consider whether Marcus might be happier with someone who complements his position, rather than constantly challenging it. You're asking me to break up with him. I'm asking you to make a mature decision based on reality rather than romantic fantasy." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her suggestions treated as commands. "Marcus has a generous heart, but he's never had to consider how his choices affect the broader family business and social standing. That's always been my job." A cool breeze swept across the terrace, carrying the distant sound of laughter from inside the ballroom, where the celebration continued without us. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her jewelry catching the light from the French doors. "If you truly care about Marcus," she continued, "you'll recognize that staying together will ultimately make both of you miserable. You'll spend years trying to prove yourself to people who will never accept you. And he'll spend years defending choices that limit his potential and effectiveness in the community. And if I don't see it that way," Victoria's smile became sharper, more calculated, "then you'll discover that love really isn't enough to overcome certain obstacles. Professional opportunities will become scarce, social invitations will dry up, and eventually even Marcus will begin to resent the isolation that comes with choosing you over his family and community connection." She reached into her small evening purse and pulled out an envelope, cream-colored paper with my name written in elegant script across the front. "This is a check for $50,000, she said simply. "Enough to pay off your student loans and give you a fresh start somewhere new. Somewhere your potential won't be limited by circumstances beyond your control." I stared at the envelope without touching it, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Victoria Hawthorne was attempting to buy me off, to pay me to disappear from her son's life like I was a problem that could be solved with money. "You think you can just write a check and make me go away? I think $50,000 represents more money than you've ever had access to at one time." Victoria replied matter-of-factly, "I think it represents freedom from financial stress and the ability to pursue your education and career without the burden of debt. I think it represents an opportunity to find someone who shares your background and values rather than constantly trying to bridge an unbridgeable gap." The envelope sat between us on the stone balustrade like a loaded weapon, cream paper stark against dark stone. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra began playing a waltz, the music drifting through the French doors and mixing with the distant sounds of the city below. "Take some time to think about it," Victoria said, turning to go back inside. "But don't take too long. Marcus deserves to build a life with someone who enhances his world rather than complicating it, and you deserve to be with someone who sees your worth without having to explain it to everyone else." She paused at the French doors, her hand resting on the ornate handle. "Oh, and Nat, if you decide to stay, you should know that I've already begun making inquiries about your academic program and research prospects in Portland. It's amazing how quickly funding can disappear when the right people express concerns about a project's viability." The threat hung in the evening air like a toxic cloud. Victoria disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving me alone on the terrace with the check and the devastating realization that she held my entire future in her perfectly manicured hand. I stood on that terrace for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 10 minutes. The envelope remained untouched on the stone balustrade, its cream paper almost luminescent in the moonlight filtering through Portland's autumn clouds. $50,000. More money than I'd ever seen at once, enough to eliminate the crushing weight of student loans that kept me awake at night calculating payment schedules and interest rates. But it wasn't really about the money, and Victoria knew. This was about power, about control, about establishing once and for all who belonged in the Hawthorne family orbit, and who could be discarded with the stroke of a pen. The French doors opened again, and this time Marcus stepped onto the terrace, his face creased with concern. "There you are," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I've been looking everywhere. Are you feeling all right? You looked pale when you left." I turned to face him, this man I loved who existed in a completely different universe from the one I'd been navigating all evening. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with the casual perfection that came from expensive cuts and good genetics. He belonged in that ballroom, in ways I was beginning to understand I never would. "I needed some air," I said simply, not trusting myself to explain the conversation I'd just endured without breaking down completely. Marcus moved to stand beside me, his arm wrapping around my waist with familiar warmth. "Mother's speeches can be overwhelming," he said with a gentle laugh. "She means well, but she sometimes gets carried away with the formal aspects of these events. I thought she did beautifully tonight, though. Did you hear how she talked about blending families and learning from different perspectives? I think that's her way of saying she's really trying to understand and appreciate what you bring to our relationship." I stared at him, wondering how two people could witness the same event and come away with such radically different interpretation. Marcus had heard acceptance and growth where I'd experienced systematic humiliation and barely veiled threats. His love for his mother and his fundamental trust in her good intentions created a filter that transformed every barbed comment into misunderstood kindness. "Marcus," I began carefully, "do you think your mother approves of our engagement?" "Of course she does," he replied immediately, his conviction absolute. "She might have some concerns about the practical aspects of blending our backgrounds, but that's natural for any parent. She wants to make sure we've thought through all the challenges we might face." The envelope caught his attention, and he frowned slightly. "What's this?" Before I could respond, he'd picked it up, his fingers tracing my name written in his mother's distinctive handwriting. "Why would Mother give you a letter? Did she want you to read something privately?" I watched his face as he processed the implications, saw the moment when confusion shifted to concern. "Natalie, what's in this envelope?" The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Telling Marcus about the check would force him to confront the reality of his mother's opposition to our relationship, would make him choose between the woman who'd raised him and the woman he claimed to love. Not telling him would leave me alone with the knowledge of just how far Victoria was willing to go to remove me from their family. "Your mother offered me money to leave you," I said quietly, the words feeling strange and surreal as they left my mouth. Marcus's expression went through several stages: disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of protective anger I'd never seen from him before. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Mother would never thought she wouldn't do something like that." $50,000, I continued, my voice gaining strength. "Enough to pay off my student loans and start over somewhere new." She explained very clearly that I don't belong in your world and that staying together will ultimately make both of us miserable. Marcus stared at the envelope like it contained something toxic. His jaw tightened and I could see him struggling to reconcile the mother he'd idealized with the calculating woman who'd just attempted to buy off his fiancé. "This has to be some kind of misunderstanding," he said, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Maybe she meant it as a gift, a way to help with your education expenses. She's always been generous with family. She was very specific about what the money was for, Mark, and she made it clear that if I refuse, she has the power to destroy my academic and professional prospects in Portland. She's already been asking questions about my research program." The color drained from Marcus's face as the full implications hit him. His mother hadn't just offered me money, she'd threatened to use her considerable influence to sabotage my career if I didn't comply. This wasn't parental concern, it was economic warfare. "I need to talk to her," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is completely unacceptable. I don't care what her concerns are. She has no right to interfere in our relationship like this." He turned toward the French doors, but I caught his arm. "Wait," I said. "Think about this carefully. If you confront her tonight in front of all these people, it becomes a public family drama. Everyone in that ballroom will know there's serious conflict between you and your mother over me. Marcus paused, recognizing the truth in what I was saying. A public confrontation would confirm every whispered speculation about whether I was the right fit for the Hawthorne family. It would also force Victoria to escalate her campaign against me, and I was beginning to understand that I hadn't yet seen the full extent of her capabilities. "So what do you want to do?" he asked, his voice strained with the effort of controlling his emotion. I looked out at Portland's skyline, the city lights blurring slightly through tears I refused to let fall. Somewhere in those buildings were the communities I'd been studying, neighborhoods where people faced real challenges with resilience and creativity. They dealt with economic pressure and social exclusion every day, but they found ways to support each other and build meaningful lives despite systemic obstacles. "I want to finish my research," I said slowly, the words forming as I spoke them. "I want to complete my degree and prove that my work has value beyond whatever Victoria Hawthorne thinks of my background." "And us?" Marcus asked quietly. I turned to face him, this good man who'd been caught in the middle of a war he'd never signed up for. "I love you," I said simply, "but I won't be bought off, and I won't be intimidated into disappearing. If your mother wants to fight, then we'll see exactly how much power she really has." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding passing between us. This wasn't just about our relationship anymore. It was about whether love and merit could triumph over money and social position. It was about whether the Portland establishment could simply eliminate anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptability. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Support," I said, "and patience. This is going to get worse before it gets better." We walked back into the ballroom together, leaving the envelope on the terrace where Victoria had placed. Let her retrieve her own bribe. I had no intention of touching money, meant to erase my existence from her son's life. The party continued around us with the brittle energy of a social gathering, where everyone sensed underlying tension, but pretended not to note. Victoria held court near the orchestra, regaling a circle of admirers with what appeared to be an amusing anecdote based on their laughter and rapt attention. She glanced up as Marcus and I rejoined the crowd, her eyes quickly cataloging our body language and facial expressions for clues about our terrace conversation. Diana Walsh appeared at my elbow with the timing of someone who'd been watching for our return. "Natalie, dear," she said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to overhear, "I was just telling the Richardsons about your graduate research, urban development, wasn't it? Such important work, helping improve conditions for people in struggling neighborhoods." The phrasing was expertly crafted to sound supportive while actually diminishing my expertise. Diana had positioned me as a social worker rather than a researcher, someone motivated by charity rather than professional competence. The distinction mattered in a room full of people who made decisions about funding and partnerships based on perceptions of capability and authority. "Actually," I replied, keeping my voice pleasant but firm, "my research focuses on economic development strategies that benefit entire communities while maintaining neighborhood character. It's quite technical, involving zoning analysis, tax increment financing, and public-private partnership structures." Diana's smile never wavered, but something sharp flickered in her eyes. "How fascinating that you're learning about those things. Victoria mentioned you didn't have much background in business or finance before starting your program." The conversation was becoming a verbal chess match, each comment designed to establish hierarchy and expertise. Diana was Victoria's lieutenant in this campaign, tasked with reinforcing the message that I was an amateur playing in a professional arena. I find that fresh perspectives often lead to innovative solutions. Sometimes experience can create blind spots that prevent people from seeing new possibilities. The comment was diplomatic enough to avoid open conflict, but pointed enough to suggest that established ways of doing things weren't necessarily the best way. Around us, other guests had begun tuning into our exchange with the heightened attention people paid to potentially explosive social situations. Mrs. Richardson, the mayor's wife, inserted herself into the conversation with the smoothness of someone accustomed to managing political tension. "How wonderful that young people are bringing new energy to urban planning," she said. "Of course, implementing any significant changes requires building consensus among stakeholders who understand the complexities involved." Translation: good ideas from outsiders were welcome as long as insiders retained control over what actually got implemented. It was a polite way of acknowledging my research while making it clear that real power remained in established hands. The orchestra finished their current piece and transitioned into something slower and more romantic. Couples began moving toward the small dance floor that had been set up near the stage, providing a graceful exit from conversations that had grown too intense for a social gathering. Marcus offered me his hand. "Would you like to dance?" I nodded gratefully, eager to escape the verbal minefield I'd been navigating with Diana and her allies. Marcus led me onto the dance floor, his arms settling around my waist as we began moving to the music. For a few moments, the rest of the room faded away, and it was just us moving together in the space we'd carved out of an increasingly hostile environment. "You handled that beautifully," Marcus murmured against my ear. "Diana can be relentless when she sets her mind to it. But you didn't let her intimidate you." "I'm learning to speak their language," I replied, though the effort was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every conversation required constant vigilance. Every comment needed to be analyzed for hidden meanings and potential traps. As we danced, I became aware of Victoria watching us from across the room. Her expression was unreadable, but I could feel her calculating gaze taking inventory of our body language, our closeness, the way Marcus looked at me. She was assessing whether her terrace gambit had achieved its intended effect or whether she needed to escalate to more direct tactics. The song ended, and couples began separating and returning to their conversations. Marcus and I remained on the dance floor for a moment longer, reluctant to return to the social battlefield that awaited us. "Mr. and Mrs. Hawthorne," a booming voice cut through the ambient chatter as Trevor Gibson, a prominent commercial real estate developer, approached with his trademark smile and firm handshake. "Congratulations on this wonderful celebration. You must be so proud of Marcus and his choice of partner." Trevor was one of Portland's most successful developers, known for his ability to navigate complex projects and municipal politics with equal skill. His presence at the engagement party represented exactly the kind of professional validation that could either help or hurt my future prospects depending on how the evening played out. "Thank you, Trevor," Richard replied warmly. "We're delighted you could join us tonight." "Wouldn't miss it," Trevor said, his attention shifting to me. "And you must be Natalie. I've been hearing interesting things about your research into sustainable development practices, urban planning with a focus on community preservation. Isn't that right?" I felt a surge of hope that someone in this room had actually taken the time to understand my work rather than dismissing it as naive idealism. "That's right," I said. "I'm particularly interested in how cities can encourage economic growth while maintaining affordability and neighborhood character." Trevor nodded thoughtfully. "Fascinating challenges. We're actually dealing with some of those issues in a project we're developing in Southeast Portland. Mixed-use development that needs to balance market pressures with community concerns." Before I could respond, Victoria appeared at Trevor's side with the fluid grace of someone who'd been monitoring the conversation from across the room. "Trevor, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice warm but her eyes sharp. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Absolutely, Victoria. I was just discussing urban development with Natalie," bright young woman, asking all the right questions about sustainable growth. Victoria's smile became more pronounced, but something predatory flickered beneath its surface. "Yes, Natalie is very enthusiastic about helping communities. She has such a generous spirit, always wanting to improve things for people less fortunate than herself." The comment was masterfully crafted. Victoria had just repositioned my professional expertise as charity work, transforming me from a potential business partner into a well-meaning volunteer. In a single sentence, she'd undermined my credibility while appearing to praise my character. Trevor's expression shifted slightly, recalibrating his assessment based on Victoria's framing. "Community outreach is certainly important," he said, his tone becoming more polite and less engaged. "We always appreciate input from people who understand grassroots perspectives, not professional analysis or expert recommendations, but insights from someone connected to the communities being affected, rather than the business interests making decisions about them." Victoria had successfully repositioned me in Trevor's mind from potential collaborator to community representative. "I should mention," Victoria continued smoothly, "that Natalie is still completing her graduate study. She's been working very hard to understand the complexities of development finance and municipal policy. Such dedication to learning. Another perfect strike." Victoria had reminded Trevor that I was still a student, rather than an established professional, emphasizing my learning process rather than my existing knowledge. She'd made me sound like an intern grateful for the opportunity to observe real business in action. Well, Trevor said, his attention already beginning to wander toward other conversations, I'm sure your research will be very valuable for academic purposes. Always good to have scholars documenting these processes. Academic purposes, documentation rather than participation. Trevor had mentally filed me away as someone who wrote about development rather than someone who could actually contribute to development projects. Marcus stepped closer to me, his hand finding mine in a gesture of support. Natalie's research has identified some innovative financing mechanisms that could be game changers for mixed-income projects, he said, trying to steer the conversation back toward my professional capabilities. Victoria's laugh was like crystal breaking. Oh, Marcus, you're such a proud fiancé. It's wonderful how supportive you are of Natalie's academic interests. Academic interests, not professional expertise or innovative research, but interests, hobbies that a loving partner indulged rather than work that deserved serious consideration. Trevor glanced at his watch with the practiced efficiency of someone managing multiple social obligations. I should circulate a bit more before the evening winds down, he said. Natalie, best of luck with your study. Marcus, always a pleasure. He disappeared into the crowd, leaving us with Victoria, whose smile had become triumphant in its politeness. In less than 5 minutes, she'd systematically dismantled my professional credibility with one of Portland's most influential developers, transforming what could have been a valuable career connection into a polite dismissal. Mother, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled anger, I think you may have given Trevor the wrong impression about Natalie's qualifications and research. Victoria's eyebrows rose in an expression of innocent surprise. Whatever do you mean, darling? I simply provided context about Natalie's current situation. Trevor is a very busy man with significant business responsibilities. I wouldn't want him to waste time on conversations that aren't relevant to his immediate needs. The explanation was perfectly reasonable and absolutely devastating. Victoria had positioned herself as Trevor's ally, protecting his valuable time from being wasted on student research that couldn't contribute to his business objectives. She'd made it seem like a favor to both Trevor and me, sparing us from an awkward mismatch of expectation. Perhaps we should discuss this later, Marcus said, recognizing that a public confrontation would only make things worse. Of course, dear, Victoria agreed readily. Though I'm not sure what there is to discuss. I simply want everyone to have realistic expectations about what Natalie can contribute at this stage of her education. This stage of her education. As if expertise and insight had to wait for some undefined graduation into the real world that Victoria controlled. As if years of intensive research and analysis counted for nothing until the right people decided to grant legitimacy. The evening continued with similar interactions, each one carefully orchestrated to reinforce my position as an outsider who didn't understand the complexities of the world I was trying to enter. Victoria moved through the room like a conductor directing an orchestra, guiding conversations and shaping perceptions with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing social and professional networks. By the time guests began saying their goodbyes, I felt like I'd been through a masterclass in social demolition. Every conversation had left me feeling smaller, less qualified, more aware of the vast gulf between my background and the established power structures that controlled opportunities in Portland's development community. Marcus and I rode home in silence, both of us processing the evening's events and their implications for our future. His apartment was in the Pearl District, a converted warehouse space with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the city's industrial architecture. It was beautiful and expensive, paid for with trust fund money that allowed him to pursue meaningful work without worrying about mundane concerns like rent or student loan. I'm sorry, he said finally, as we stood in his living room, city lights painting geometric patterns across the hardwood floors. I knew Mother could be protective, but I never imagined she would go that far. It's not your fault, I replied, though part of me wondered how he could have been so blind to his mother's capabilities. But we need to be realistic about what we're up against. Marcus poured himself a glass of whiskey from the expensive bottle he kept for special occasions, then offered me one. I accepted it gratefully, needing something to burn away the taste of an evening that had started with such hope and ended with such devastating clarity. "What do you want to do?" he asked, echoing his earlier question on the terrace. I walked to the windows looking out at the city where I'd been trying to build a future. Portland sprawled before us, a mixture of established neighborhoods and new development, old money and emerging opportunity. Somewhere in that urban landscape were the answers I'd been seeking through my research, solutions that could benefit everyone rather than just the people wealthy enough to buy their way into exclusive social circles. "I want to finish my dissertation," I said slowly. "I want to prove that my ideas have merit regardless of what your mother thinks of my pedigree." And then, I turned to face him, this man I loved who represented everything Victoria was fighting to protect. "Then we'll see if love really is enough to overcome the kind of power your family wields in this city." Marcus nodded, understanding that we'd crossed into territory where good intentions and romantic idealism might not be sufficient weapons against systematic exclusion and economic pressure. We were about to discover whether merit and determination could triumph over inherited privilege and established networks. "I'll support you however I can," he said simply, "even if it means choosing between me and your family." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey as if it might contain answers to questions he'd never been forced to consider. "I hope it doesn't come to that," he said finally. But we both knew it already. Victoria had made her position clear and she'd demonstrated her willingness to use every tool at her disposal to remove me from her son's life. The only question now was whether I had the strength and skill to fight back against someone who'd been winning these battles since before I was born. I finished my whiskey and set the glass down on Marcus's coffee table, a piece of reclaimed wood that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Tomorrow I would return to my small apartment, my second-hand furniture, my stack of library books and borrowed laptop. I would continue working on research that Victoria had just systematically discredited among the very people whose support I needed to turn academic theory into practical reality. But tonight I had learned something valuable about the nature of power and the lengths people would go to protect their positions. Victoria Hawthorne had just given me a masterclass in social and economic warfare, and I intended to put that education to good use. 3 weeks after the engagement party, I discovered exactly how far Victoria's influence extended when Professor Martinez called me into his office with the kind of expression that preceded bad news. His corner office in the Urban Studies building overlooked the Willamette River, bookshelves lined with decades of research on city planning and community development. I'd spent countless hours in this space discussing my dissertation, refining methodologies and exploring theoretical frameworks that could address Portland's housing affordability crisis. "Natalie," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your research project." I settled into the familiar chair across from his desk, my stomach already tightening with apprehension. "What kind of Professor Martinez pulled out a folder thick with official university letterhead and documentation. "The Hawthorne Foundation has formally requested a review of your dissertation topic and methodology. They're questioning whether your research meets appropriate academic standards for objectivity and scholarly rigor." The Hawthorne Foundation. Of course, Victoria hadn't just threatened to use her influence, she'd already begun implementing her strategy to discredit my work through official channels. The foundation was the family's philanthropic arm, a respected organization that funded urban development projects and academic research throughout the Pacific Northwest. "What specific objections are they raising?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "They suggest your research design shows inherent bias toward low-income communities, and that your conclusions about mixed-income development are predetermined rather than evidence-based." Professor Martinez's tone was carefully neutral, but I could see the conflict in his expression. "They're also questioning whether you have sufficient background in economics and municipal finance to properly analyze the complex systems you're studying." Every accusation was carefully crafted to sound like legitimate academic concern while actually attacking my credibility and qualification. Victoria had done her homework, identifying exactly which criticisms would carry weight in an academic environment, and framing them in language that forced the university to take them seriously. "Professor, you've been supervising my research for 2 years. You know my methodology is sound and my background preparation was thorough." "I absolutely know that," he replied quickly, Your work is some of the most innovative and rigorous research I've seen from a graduate student. But the foundation carries significant weight with the administration, and they're demanding a formal review process that could delay your dissertation defense indefinitely. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Delaying my defense meant delaying my graduation, which meant extending my financial precariousness and pushing back any hope of establishing professional credibility in Portland's development community. Victoria was using bureaucratic procedures as weapons, turning the academic process itself into a tool for harassment. There's more, Professor Martinez continued reluctantly. The foundation is also reviewing all current grants and funding commitments. They're suggesting that research projects with questionable objectivity shouldn't receive financial support from organizations committed to evidence-based policymaking. My graduate assistantship, the small stipend that allowed me to afford basic living expenses while completing my degree. Victoria was threatening to eliminate the financial support that made it possible for me to stay in school at all. This is retaliation, I said flatly. The foundation is trying to punish me for personal reasons that have nothing to do with my academic work. Professor Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. I believe you're right, but proving that would require challenging one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in the region. The university administration isn't eager to pick that fight without compelling evidence of improper behavior. What would constitute compelling evidence? Documentation of explicit instructions to target your research for non-academic reasons. Testimony from foundation staff about improper pressure being applied. Something that clearly demonstrates the review process is being used vindictively, rather than legitimate. In other words, I needed proof that Victoria had deliberately weaponized the foundation against me. Proof that she would never be careless enough to provide. She was too sophisticated to leave paper trails or witnesses that could expose her real motivation. I walked across campus in a daze, my mind struggling to process the systematic way Victoria was dismantling my academic and professional prospects. Students hurried past carrying backpacks and coffee cups, absorbed in their own educational journeys and probably unaware that higher education could be weaponized by people with enough influence and determination. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Can we meet for lunch? Important news to share. I found him at our usual spot, a small cafe near campus that served decent sandwiches and strong coffee to students and faculty. He was already seated at a corner table, his expression a mixture of excitement and concern that suggested complicated development. You're not going to believe what happened this morning, he said as I sat down. I had a meeting with the board of directors for Hawthorne Luxury Property. Hawthorne Luxury Properties was the family's primary business, a commercial real estate development company that had been shaping Portland's urban landscape for over 3 decades. Marcus worked there in a senior development role, though I'd always suspected his position had more to do with family legacy than professional achievement. Let me guess, I said wearily. Your mother convinced them I'm a security risk who might leak proprietary information about development projects. Marcus looked surprised. Actually, no. They offered me a promotion to regional director with oversight of all Northwest operations. It's a huge opportunity, basically putting me in line to eventually run the entire company. The news should have been cause for celebration, but something in Marcus's tone suggested underlying complications. That's wonderful, I said carefully. You've been working towards something like this for years. There's a catch, he said, confirming my suspicions. The position requires extensive travel throughout Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. I'd be based in Seattle for at least the next 2 years, possibly longer depending on project timelines. Seattle, 3 hours away from Portland, far enough to effectively end our relationship unless I abandoned my academic program and followed him. Victoria had found another angle of attack, using Marcus's career ambitions to create geographic separation that would accomplish what financial pressure and social isolation hadn't achieved. When would you need to start? I asked. Next month. They want me to begin immediately with some major projects they're launching in the Puget Sound region. I stared at my untouched sandwich, understanding the impossible position Victoria had created. Marcus was being offered genuine career advancement, the kind of opportunity that could define his professional future. Asking him to refuse would mean sacrificing his ambitions for a relationship that his family was determined to destroy. "What do you want to do?" I asked. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand. "I want to turn it down and stay here with you." But Mother made it clear that refusing this position would be seen as choosing personal desires over family responsibility. She said it would raise questions about my commitment to the business and my readiness for leadership roles. Translation: Victoria had structured the offer so that staying in Portland to support me would damage Marcus's standing within his own family company. She'd found a way to make our relationship directly conflict with his professional prospects, forcing him to choose between love and career advancement. "You should take the position," I said quietly. "Natalie, no, we can make this work. You could finish your dissertation research remotely, maybe even find opportunities in Seattle's development community." I shook my head. "Your mother would make sure I faced the same obstacles in Seattle that I'm facing here, and asking me to abandon my research now would mean letting her win without even fighting back." Marcus's grip on my hand tightened. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying she's forcing us to choose between our relationship and our individual future. And maybe that choice itself tells us something important about whether we can build a sustainable life together." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us recognizing that Victoria's latest maneuver had created a crisis that couldn't be resolved through compromise or negotiation. She'd identified the fundamental tension between our personal desires and our professional ambitions, then systematically amplified that tension until it became unbearable. "There has to be another way," Marcus said finally. "Maybe." But it won't come from trying to negotiate with your mother or hoping she'll eventually accept me. She's made it clear that she views this as a war, and she's winning because she understands the battlefield better than we do." That afternoon, I walked through Southeast Portland's Belmont neighborhood, one of the areas I'd been studying for my dissertation research. The district had undergone significant gentrification over the past decade, with trendy restaurants and boutique shops replacing older businesses that had served the community's working-class residents. It was exactly the kind of transformation my research addressed, exploring how cities could encourage economic development while preserving affordability and community character. I stopped at a small community center where I'd been conducting interviews with longtime residents about their experiences with neighborhood change. The director, Ms. Chen, was an elderly Taiwanese immigrant who'd been advocating for affordable housing and small business support for over 20 years. "You look troubled, dear," she said as I entered her cluttered office filled with filing cabinets and community resource flyers. "Is your research not going well?" I explained the situation with the Hawthorne Foundation's challenge to my academic work, leaving out the personal details, but describing the pressure being applied to discredit my findings. Miss Chen listened carefully, nodding with the understanding of someone who'd faced similar obstacles throughout her advocacy career. "Powerful people don't like research that questions their methods," she said simply. "But that doesn't mean the research is wrong. How do you keep fighting when the system seems designed to prevent change?" "You find other ways to create pressure," she replied. "Powerful people respond to public attention, economic consequences, and threats to their reputation. Sometimes you have to make the cost of opposing you higher than the cost of accepting what you're trying to accomplish." Her words stayed with me as I walked home through neighborhoods where working families were being displaced by development projects that prioritized profit over community stability. Victoria Hawthorne wielded enormous influence within Portland's established power structure, but that structure wasn't the only source of leverage available. That evening, I sat in my small apartment reviewing my dissertation research with new eyes. For 2 years, I'd been documenting how thoughtful development policies could benefit both developers and communities, assuming that presenting evidence and logical arguments would be sufficient to change minds and influence practice. But Victoria's systematic campaign against me had revealed the naivety of that approach. Evidence and logic mattered only when the people evaluating them were operating in good faith. When opponents were motivated by personal animosity or threatened interests, academic rigor became irrelevant. What mattered was power, leverage, and the ability to impose consequences for continued opposition. I opened my laptop and began drafting a new kind of document, something that would never appear in an academic journal but might prove far more effective than any peer-reviewed research paper. I started compiling information about the Hawthorne Foundation's grant-making practices, their board composition, their funding priorities, and their public commitments to supporting diverse perspectives in urban development research. If Victoria wanted to weaponize academic institutions against me, I could examine whether her foundation was living up to its stated mission of promoting innovative and inclusive approaches to community development. If she wanted to question my objectivity and qualifications, I could investigate whether the foundation's grant-making showed bias toward researchers and projects that supported predetermined conclusions favorable to the Hawthorne family's business interests. My phone rang, interrupting my research. The caller ID showed my graduate school friend Elena Rodriguez, who worked as an investigative journalist for Portland's alternative weekly newspaper. I heard through the academic gossip network that you're dealing with some foundation pressure about your dissertation, she said without preamble. Want to tell me what's really going on? Elena and I had become friends during our undergraduate years at Portland State, bonding over our shared experience as first-generation college students navigating institutions designed for people with more privileged backgrounds. She'd gone into journalism while I'd pursued urban planning, but we'd maintained our friendship and mutual support throughout graduate school. I explained the situation with the Hawthorne Foundation, including the personal context of my relationship with Marcus and Victoria's systematic campaign to force me out of her son's life. Holy shit, Elena said when I finished. That's not just academic harassment, that's abuse of philanthropic power for personal vendettas. Do you have documentation of the Foundation's complaints about your research? Some of it. Professor Martinez showed me the formal review request, but I don't have copies of all the correspondence. I want to look into this, Elena said, her journalist instincts clearly activated. The public has a right to know when major foundations are using their influence to silence research that conflicts with their donors' interests. Can you get me copies of whatever documentation you have access to? For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope. Victoria's power depended largely on operating behind closed doors, using informal pressure and bureaucratic procedures to achieve her goals without public scrutiny. Journalism could shine light on those hidden processes, forcing accountability and transparency that might limit her ability to continue her campaign. Be careful, I warned Elena. The Hawthorne family has serious legal resources and social connections throughout the city. If you're going to investigate them, you need to be absolutely certain of your facts. That's why I became a journalist instead of an activist, Elena replied. I know how to document everything and protect my sources, but I also know how to ask uncomfortable questions that powerful people prefer not to answer publicly. Over the next week, Elena and I worked together to build a comprehensive picture of the Hawthorne Foundation's activities and influence. She used her journalistic access to review public records, interview current and former grant recipients, and examine the Foundation's stated mission against its actual funding pattern. What we discovered was a pattern of supporting research and projects that consistently favored market-driven development approaches, while marginalizing work that questioned those methods or advocated for stronger community protection measures. The Foundation funded plenty of academic research, but virtually all of it concluded that reducing regulatory barriers and increasing private investment were the best strategies for urban development. This is basically academic money laundering, Elena explained as we reviewed her findings in a downtown coffee shop. They're using philanthropic funding to create a body of supposedly independent research that actually promotes conclusions favorable to their business interests. But is that illegal? I asked. Not necessarily. Foundations are allowed to fund research that aligns with their philosophical priorities, but they're supposed to support genuine academic inquiry, not predetermined outcomes. And they're definitely not supposed to use grant-making as a weapon against researchers who challenge their preferred narrative. Elena had also discovered something potentially more damaging. The Foundation's board of directors included several people who had direct financial relationships with Hawthorne luxury property. Board members who voted on academic grant funding also owned property that benefited from the company's development projects or provided professional services to the Hawthorne family business. That's a serious conflict of interest. Elena continued. Foundation board members are supposed to make funding decisions based on the organization's charitable mission, not their personal financial interests. What can we do with this information? I'm going to write a series of articles examining how Portland's major philanthropic organizations influence academic research and public policy. The Hawthorne Foundation will be a central case study, but I'll include other examples to show this is a broader systemic issue. And if they try to retaliate against you, Elena grinned, let them try. Nothing draws more journalistic attention than powerful people attempting to suppress negative coverage. Plus, my editor has been looking for opportunities to examine how old money families maintain their influence in Portland's supposedly progressive political environment. While Elena worked on her investigative series, I focused on documenting every aspect of Victoria's campaign against me. I requested copies of all correspondence between the Hawthorne Foundation and the university administration. I reached out to other graduate students who'd applied for foundation funding to see if any of them had experienced similar scrutiny or pressure. Most importantly, I began building relationships with community organizations and advocacy groups that had their own complicated histories with the Hawthorne family's development projects. These groups had been fighting gentrification and displacement for years, often finding themselves opposed to developments that benefited from Hawthorne Foundation research grants. Mrs. Chen introduced me to a network of community leaders who'd been working on affordable housing and tenant protection issues throughout Portland's rapidly changing neighborhood. They'd accumulated their own documentation of how academic research funded by major developers was used to justify policies that prioritized profit over community stability. We've been trying to challenge these practices for years, explained James Washington, a longtime advocate for affordable housing preservation. But we never had access to someone with your academic credentials and research skills who was willing to examine the foundation's activities from the inside. Working with these community partners, I began developing a comprehensive analysis of how philanthropic funding was being used to shape academic research and public policy in ways that benefited wealthy donors, while marginalizing voices advocating for community protection and economic justice. It was exactly the kind of research that had gotten me into trouble with the Hawthorne Foundation in the first place, but now I understood that trouble was inevitable regardless of what I studied. Victoria had made it clear that my background and perspective were themselves threats to the established order she was determined to protect. Marcus called that evening while I was organizing files and interview transcripts for my expanded research project. I've been thinking about your suggestion that I take the Seattle position, he said, his voice strained with conflicting emotions. Maybe you're right that some distance might give us space to figure out how to handle Mother's opposition to our relationship. Marcus, I said gently, this isn't about distance or time. Your mother isn't going to suddenly develop tolerance for me because I'm in a different city. She's going to continue using every tool at her disposal to eliminate me from your life. And accepting that reality is the first step toward deciding how to respond. So what are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that we stop trying to manage her opposition and start fighting back. I'm suggesting that we expose what she's doing and force her to face consequences for abusing her power. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. That sounds like declaring war against my own family. Your mother already declared war against me, I replied. The only question is whether you're going to help her win or help me fight back. The conversation ended without resolution, but I could hear the internal struggle in Marcus's voice. He was beginning to understand that remaining neutral in this conflict was effectively choosing his mother's side. But he wasn't ready to actively oppose the woman who'd raised him and shaped his entire understanding of family loyalty. 2 days later, Elena's first article appeared in Portland Mercury with the headline, Foundation Politics: How Philanthropic Funding Shapes Portland's Development Debate. The piece examined several major foundations, including Hawthorne, and documented patterns of funding that consistently supported research favorable to donor interests while marginalizing alternative perspectives. The article was carefully researched and diplomatically written, focusing on systemic issues rather than personal attacks, but it included enough specific details about the Hawthorne Foundation's activities to make clear that the organization was using charitable funding to promote predetermined conclusions rather than genuine academic inquiry. Victoria's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the article's publication, my graduate advisor received a formal complaint from the Foundation's legal counsel, alleging that I had violated confidentiality agreements and misused privileged information in my communications with journalists. "This is exactly what we expected," Professor Martinez told me when he called that evening. "They're trying to characterize your cooperation with legitimate journalism as academic misconduct. It's a transparent attempt at intimidation, but the university administration is nervous about the legal implications." What does that mean for my dissertation defense? It means the formal review process is definitely moving forward, and now they're adding allegations of unprofessional conduct to their academic concerns. You need to prepare for a sustained battle that could affect your degree completion and future career prospects. I hung up the phone and stared out the window of my apartment at Portland's downtown skyline. Somewhere in those office buildings, Victoria Hawthorne was orchestrating a campaign designed to destroy my academic and professional future. She was using resources accumulated over decades of wealth and influence to crush someone she viewed as a threat to her family's social position. But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that someone from my background would be intimidated by institutional pressure and legal threats, that I would eventually surrender rather than risk everything in a fight against overwhelming odds. She didn't understand that people who'd grown up without inherited advantages develop different kinds of strength, different approaches to solving problems when conventional channels were closed to them. She didn't realize that forcing me to choose between submission and open warfare meant I had nothing left to lose. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to Elena, outlining new research directions that would examine not just the Hawthorne Foundation's grant-making practice, but the broader network of relationships between Portland's philanthropic organizations, development companies, and municipal decision-makers. If Victoria wanted to play for keeps, I was ready to show her what happened when someone with nothing to lose decided to fight back. The turning point came 6 weeks later when Marcus called me at 2 a.m. His voice shaking with anger and disbelief. I'd been asleep in my apartment, dreaming of spreadsheets and foundation tax filings, when my phone buzzed against the nightstand. "Natalie, I need you to come over right now. I found something you need to see." I drove through Portland's empty streets, my mind racing with possibility. Marcus had been increasingly distant since accepting the Seattle position, caught between his loyalty to his family and his growing awareness of his mother's systematic campaign against. We'd barely spoken in the past 2 weeks, our relationship strained by forces neither of us seemed able to control. His apartment was blazing with lights when I arrived, every lamp switched on as if he were afraid of shadow. Marcus met me at the door wearing wrinkled clothes and an expression I'd never seen before, equal parts fury and devastation. "She's been planning this for months," he said without preamble, leading me to his dining room table where documents were spread across the surface like evidence at a crime scene. Everything. The engagement party, the foundation complaint, my job transfer, all of it. I stared at the papers scattered across the table. Financial records, email printouts, legal documents, and what appeared to be private investigator reports. The scope of material was staggering, representing far more information than Marcus should have had access to through normal channels. "Where did you get all this?" "Diana Walsh," Marcus said, his voice bitter. "Mother's closest ally and co-conspirator. Apparently she's been documenting everything, keeping records of their strategy sessions and planning meetings. She called me tonight and said she couldn't live with what they were doing anymore." I picked up one of the documents, a detailed timeline titled Natalie Brooks' Intervention Strategy. The file outlined a comprehensive plan to eliminate me from Marcus's life, beginning with background research conducted months before our engagement and extending through multiple scenarios for forcing our separation. The timeline was chilling in its precision. Victoria had begun investigating me within weeks of Marcus mentioning my name at a family dinner. She'd used private investigators to examine my financial situation, academic record, family background, and social connection. She'd identified my graduate program vulnerabilities, my dependence on fellowship funding, and my aspirations within Portland's development community. "Look at this," Marcus said, pointing to a section dated 3 weeks before our engagement party. "They planned every detail of that evening specifically to humiliate you publicly. The seating arrangements, the guest list, even the topics of conversation were orchestrated to make you feel isolated and inadequate. I read through the planning documents with growing horror. Victoria and Diana had identified specific guests who could be counted on to make subtly disparaging comments about my background. They'd rehearsed conversation topics designed to emphasize my outsider status. They'd even arranged for certain people to exclude me from group discussions and social interactions. The coffee incident wasn't an accident, I said, remembering how I'd been the only person not offered refreshments during the party. Nothing was an accident, Marcus replied. They stage managed every moment to create maximum psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone questioned their behavior, they could claim it was all misunderstandings or social awkwardness. I continued reading through the documents, discovering layers of manipulation I hadn't even recognized at the time. Victoria had researched the backgrounds of every guest at the engagement party, identifying those who could be influenced to participate in my social isolation. She'd provided talking points to key individuals, suggesting specific phrases and topics that would undermine my confidence without crossing into obvious cruelty. The foundation complaint against my dissertation had been planned months in advance, with Victoria consulting legal experts about the most effective ways to challenge academic research without exposing herself to retaliation. She'd identified the specific procedural mechanisms that would delay my graduation and threaten my funding, understanding exactly how to weaponize university bureaucracy. This document here, Marcus said, his hand trembling as he pointed to a legal memo, shows that she consulted with employment attorneys about whether challenging your research could be considered tortious interference with your career prospects. She knew exactly what she was doing and made sure it was technically legal. The private investigator reports were perhaps the most disturbing element of the collection. Victoria had authorized extensive surveillance of my activities, including my research interviews, my meetings with community organizations, and my personal relationships. The investigators had documented my daily routines, my financial struggles, and my academic challenges with the thoroughness of a military intelligence operation. She knows everything about your life, Marcus said quietly. Your work schedule, your research methods, your friendships, your family situation. She's been treating you like an enemy combatant rather than someone I love. I found a section of the file labeled leverage points that cataloged my vulnerabilities with clinical precision. My student loan debt, my dependence on graduate funding, my lack of family wealth, my limited social connections within Portland's elite circles. Victoria had identified every pressure point that could be used to force me out of Marcus's life. But the most devastating revelation was a series of emails between Victoria and Diana discussing their long-term strategy. They'd anticipated that I might resist their initial pressure tactics, so they'd developed escalation plans that included professional sabotage, social ostracism, and economic warfare. Read this one, Marcus said, handing me a printed email dated 2 months early. It's from Mother to Diana, about their backup plans if the foundation complaint didn't work. The email outlined strategies for ensuring I would be blacklisted from Portland's development community regardless of my academic credentials. Victoria had identified key decision-makers in municipal government, major development firms, and nonprofit organizations who could be influenced to exclude me from job opportunities and professional networks. She's been actively destroying your career prospects, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Not just blocking your current research, but making sure you'd never be able to work in urban planning anywhere in the Pacific Northwest. The scope of Victoria's campaign was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. She'd turned my entire professional future into a weapon against our relationship, ensuring that staying with Marcus would mean sacrificing any hope of building a meaningful career in my chosen field. Why is Diana giving you this information now? I asked, trying to process the implications of everything I was reading. Because she found out about the nuclear option, Marcus replied grimly. Look at the last section of the file. I flipped to the final documents, which outlined what Victoria called definitive intervention strategy. These plans involved using the Hawthorne family's extensive legal resources to challenge my immigration status, despite the fact that I was a natural-born citizen. They'd researched ways to trigger IRS audits of my family's modest finances, looking for any irregularities that could be used to create legal problems. Most chilling of all was a plan to use their connections in academic and professional circles to spread rumors about research misconduct, plagiarism, and ethical violations that would destroy my reputation permanently. Victoria had identified specific individuals who could be influenced to make accusations that would be difficult to disprove, even if they were entirely fabricated. "She's planning to destroy your life completely," Marcus said, his voice hollow with shock. "Not just separate us, but ensure that you're left with nothing, no career, no reputation, no future prospects." Diana's accompanying note explained that she'd become increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating nature of Victoria's campaign. What had started as efforts to discourage an unsuitable relationship had evolved into a systematic program of persecution that crossed moral and potentially legal boundaries. "I can't be party to this anymore," Diana had written. "What we're doing to that girl has gone far beyond protecting family interests. We're destroying an innocent person's life out of social prejudice and personal spite." I sat in silence, absorbing the full scope of what Victoria had orchestrated against me. The engagement party humiliation, the academic harassment, the professional sabotage, all of it had been carefully planned and executed as part of a comprehensive strategy to eliminate me from Marcus's life. "What do you want to do?" Marcus looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of love, rage, and determination that transformed his usually gentle features into something harder and more resolute. "I want to stop her," he said simply. "I want to use everything Diana gave us to expose what she's been doing and make sure she faces consequences for abusing her power. That means going to war with your own mother." "She went to war with the woman I love," Marcus replied. "She made this choice, not me." Over the next several hours, we organized the documents and developed a strategy for responding to Victoria's campaign. The evidence Diana had provided was extensive enough to support multiple lines of attack: media exposure, legal challenges, regulatory complaints, and professional accountability measures. Elena Rodriguez arrived at dawn, her eyes bright with journalistic excitement as she reviewed the materials we'd assembled. "This is extraordinary," she said, photographing documents and taking notes with rapid precision. "We're not just talking about Foundation misconduct anymore. This is a comprehensive abuse of power that involves multiple institutions and potentially illegal activities. What can we do with this information?" I asked. "Everything," Elena replied. "This documentation proves that the Hawthorne Foundation has been using charitable resources for personal vendettas, which violates their tax-exempt status. It shows coordination between supposedly independent organizations to harass and intimidate you, which could constitute conspiracy. And it demonstrates that Victoria has been using her social and economic power to interfere with your constitutional rights to education and employment." Elena explained that the documentation provided grounds for complaints to multiple regulatory agencies, including the IRS, the Oregon Attorney General's Office, and the university administration. More importantly, it gave us the evidence needed to shift the narrative from defensive responses to Victoria's attacks to proactive exposure of her systematic abuse of power. "We need to be strategic about how we release this information," Elena continued. "If we dump everything at once, it becomes overwhelming and people might dismiss it as a personal vendetta. But if we release it systematically, building from smaller revelations to larger ones, we can create sustained pressure that forces accountability." Marcus nodded grimly. "What's the most effective way to make sure Mother faces real consequences for what she's done?" "Public exposure combined with regulatory action," Elena replied. "The Foundation's board of directors and major donors need to understand that their organization has been compromised by personal agendas. The university administration needs to see evidence that their review processes have been manipulated by external pressure. And Portland's broader community needs to understand how wealthy families use philanthropic organizations to silence critics and eliminate threats." I spent the morning calling Professor Martinez to request an emergency meeting, reaching out to my contacts in community organizations, and coordinating with Elena about the timing of her expanded investigative series. The documentation Diana had provided transformed our situation from defensive crisis management to strategic counterattack. Professor Martinez arrived at his office that afternoon with the wary expression of someone who'd been dealing with escalating institutional pressure for weeks. When I laid out the evidence of Victoria's systematic campaign, his expression shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally grim determination. "This is the most egregious abuse of Foundation influence I've ever seen," he said, reviewing the timeline and planning document. "They've weaponized charitable organizations and academic institutions to conduct a personal vendetta. This isn't just misconduct, it's corruption of the entire system. What can the university do about it? Immediately suspend the Foundation's complaint against your dissertation and launch a formal investigation into how their review processes were compromised," Professor Martinez replied. "This evidence shows that the Foundation was operating in bad faith from the beginning, using academic procedures as tools of harassment rather than legitimate quality control, and my funding situation completely restored, with additional support to compensate for the stress and delays caused by this interference. The university has a responsibility to protect students from exactly this kind of external pressure." That evening, Marcus and I met with James Washington and other community leaders who'd been documenting the Hawthorne family's impact on Portland's development path. The evidence Diana had provided confirmed many of their suspicions about how philanthropic funding was being used to shape academic research and public policy. "We've been fighting these battles for years without understanding the full scope of what we were up against," James explained. "This documentation shows that the Foundation has been systematically funding research that supports predetermined conclusions, while excluding perspectives that challenge their preferred approaches. What's the best way to use this information to create lasting change?" I asked. "Combine it with our existing documentation of how their development projects have affected communities," James replied. "Show the direct connection between biased research funding and harmful development practices. Make it clear that this isn't just about academic integrity, but about how wealthy families use charitable organizations to maintain systems that benefit them at the expense of everyone else." The community organizations had been building their own case against the Hawthorne family's development practices, documenting displacement, gentrification, and the systematic exclusion of community voices from planning processes. Combined with the evidence of Foundation misconduct, they could demonstrate a pattern of abuse that extended far beyond my personal situation. Elena's second article appeared 3 days later with the headline, "Documents Reveal Systematic Harassment Campaign by Portland Foundation." The piece focused specifically on the Hawthorne Foundation's activities, using Diana's documentation to expose the deliberate nature of their campaign against my research and career prospects. The article was devastating in its precision, presenting evidence of planning meetings, strategy sessions, and coordination between multiple organizations to harass and intimidate someone whose only crime was conducting research that challenged their preferred narrative. Elena had verified every detail and cross-referenced the documentation with public records and independent sources. Victoria's response was immediate and desperate. Within hours of the article's publication, her attorneys issued statements claiming that the documents were fabricated, that Diana Walsh was a disgruntled former associate, spreading false information, and that the Foundation had acted entirely within legal boundaries in raising concerns about academic misconduct. But the damage was already done. The documentation was too extensive and detailed to be dismissed as fabrication, and Diana had provided corroborating evidence that verified the authenticity of the material. More importantly, the article had shifted the narrative from questions about my research to questions about the Hawthorne Foundation's integrity and conduct. The Foundation's board of directors called an emergency meeting to review the allegations and determine their response. Several major donors privately expressed concerns about their association with an organization that had been exposed as using charitable resources for personal vendetta. The university administration announced that they were suspending all review processes related to Foundation complaints, pending a comprehensive investigation. Marcus called me that evening with news that Victoria had requested a family meeting to discuss recent developments and misunderstanding. Her tone, according to Marcus,
had been carefully controlled but lacking the absolute confidence that had characterized her earlier communications. She's realizing that her usual tactics aren't working, he said. The public exposure and regulatory pressure have created consequences she can't control through her normal channels of influence. What do you think she'll try next? I think she'll try to negotiate, Marcus replied. She's a strategic thinker, and she has to recognize that continuing this campaign will only generate more negative attention. She'll probably try to frame this as a misunderstanding and look for ways to minimize the damage to her reputation. But I was beginning to understand that Victoria's strategic thinking had blind spots, particularly when it came to understanding people who didn't share her background and assumptions. She'd spent months treating me like a problem that could be solved through money, pressure, and intimidation, never considering that I might have my own resources and capabilities. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Elena called with barely contained excitement in her voice. I just got off the phone with a source at the Oregon Attorney General's office, she said. They're opening a formal investigation into the Hawthorne Foundation's tax-exempt status and grant-making practice. The documentation we provided shows clear evidence of using charitable resources for non-charitable purposes. What does that mean? It means Victoria could face serious legal consequences, including the revocation of the foundation's tax-exempt status, personal liability for misuse of charitable funds, and potential criminal charges if the investigation uncovers evidence of fraud or conspiracy.
The Attorney General's investigation would be public, creating sustained scrutiny of the Foundation's activities and Victoria's role in directing them. It would also trigger reviews by other regulatory agencies and potentially expose the full extent of her family's influence peddling activities. There's more, Elena continued. The IRS is reviewing the Foundation's tax filings based on our complaints about charitable purpose violations. And the university has announced that they're conducting their own investigation into how Foundation pressure was used to compromise academic integrity. I sat in my apartment, staring out at Portland's skyline, and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. 6 months ago, I'd been an anonymous graduate student, conducting research on urban development policy. Now I was at the center of a public controversy that threatened to expose systemic corruption in Portland's philanthropic and academic communities. Victoria Hawthorne had tried to destroy me using every tool at her disposal, from social humiliation to economic pressure to institutional harassment. But her campaign had ultimately exposed the very systems of power and influence she'd been trying to protect, creating consequences that extended far beyond our personal conflict. My phone rang, displaying Marcus's number. When I answered, his voice was tense with barely controlled emotion. "Mother wants to meet with you," he said. "She's requesting a private conversation to discuss resolving this situation before it causes more damage to everyone involved." "What do you think?" "I think she's finally realized that she's fighting someone who won't be intimidated or bought off," Marcus replied. "And I think she's starting to understand that this battle is costing her more than she's willing to pay." The meeting was scheduled for the next afternoon at Victoria's downtown office, neutral territory where she could maintain her professional composure while attempting to negotiate an end to the escalating conflict. As I prepared for what might be our final confrontation, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics had shifted since that evening on the country club terrace. Victoria had spent months trying to make me disappear, but her efforts had only made me more visible, more connected to communities and causes that shared my commitment to challenging entrenched power. She'd tried to isolate me from professional opportunities, but her campaign had created new alliances with journalists, community organizers, and academic colleagues who understood the broader implications of her action. Most importantly, she'd forced me to discover capabilities and resources I'd never known I possessed. The quiet graduate student, who'd been overwhelmed by an engagement party, had evolved into someone who could build coalitions, generate media attention, and navigate complex regulatory processes to hold powerful people accountable for their actions. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether Victoria was ready to accept the consequences of her campaign, or whether she would continue fighting a battle she could no longer win. Either way, I was finally ready to face her as an equal rather than a victim, armed with evidence, allies, and the hard-won understanding that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to fight back harder than they're willing to fight. Victoria's downtown office occupied the entire 42nd floor of Portland's most prestigious business tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the Willamette River and the Cascade Mountains beyond. The space was designed to intimidate, with museum-quality art, imported marble floors, and furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Every detail communicated power, wealth, and the kind of influence that had shaped Portland's development for decades. I arrived precisely on time, wearing a charcoal business suit I'd purchased specifically for this meeting, not because I needed to impress Victoria, but because I wanted her to see that I understood the importance of this moment and had prepared accordingly. The receptionist, a perfectly groomed woman in her 30s, escorted me through corridors lined with photographs of major development projects bearing the Hawthorne name. Victoria waited in her private conference room, seated at the head of a polished table that could accommodate 20 people but held only 2 chairs today. She wore a cream-colored designer suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, her silver hair styled in the same elegant chignon she'd worn to the engagement party. But something had changed in her demeanor. The absolute confidence that had characterized our previous encounters had been replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. "Natalie," she said, rising to offer a handshake with the practiced grace of someone who'd conducted thousands of business meetings. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I believe we have much to discuss." I accepted the handshake, noting the slight tremor in her fingers that betrayed the stress she was working to conceal. "Mrs. Hawthorne," I replied, deliberately avoiding the familiar address she'd once insisted upon. "I'm curious to hear what you have to say." Victoria gestured for me to sit, then moved to a sidebar where crystal decanters held what appeared to be expensive whiskey and brandy. "May I offer you something to drink? I find that difficult conversations often benefit from a touch of civility." "No, thank you. I prefer to keep this meeting brief and focused." She poured herself a small measure of amber liquid, using the ritual to buy time while she organized her thoughts. When she returned to the table, her expression had settled into the mask of polished professionalism that had served her throughout decades of high-stakes negotiation. "I want to begin by acknowledging that recent events have created some unfortunate misunderstandings between us," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I believe we've both allowed our protective instincts to escalate a situation that should have been resolved through honest communication." The phrasing was masterful, simultaneously acknowledging conflict while avoiding responsibility for creating it. Victoria was treating our confrontation like a business dispute between equals, rather than the systematic campaign of harassment she'd orchestrated against me. "Misunderstandings," I repeated, letting the word hang in the air between us. "Is that what you call using your foundation to sabotage my academic research, hiring private investigators to document my personal life, planning to fabricate accusations of research misconduct?" Victoria's composure flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression of surprise that she'd recovered from before most people would have noticed. "I can see why you might interpret certain actions in that light," she said carefully. "But I want you to understand that everything I've done has been motivated by genuine concern for my family's welfare and my son's future happiness. Your concern involved trying to bribe me with $50,000 to disappear from Marcus's life. I offered you financial assistance to pursue opportunities that might better align with your goals and background." Victoria corrected smoothly. "I thought it would be kinder to provide you with resources to build a life that didn't require constant struggle against social and economic barriers." Even now, facing exposure and potential legal consequences, Victoria was reframing her actions as benevolent gestures rather than the calculated attacks they'd actually. Her ability to maintain this fiction, even in private conversation, revealed something disturbing about her capacity for self-deception. And the systematic campaign to destroy my career prospects, the coordination with academic institutions to challenge my research, the plans to spread false accusations about my professional conduct. Victoria sipped her drink, using the gesture to buy time while she crafted her response. "I may have been overzealous in my efforts to protect Marcus from what I perceived as potential complications," she admitted. "But you must understand that my son's happiness and success are my primary concerns. I've spent 30 years building the foundations for his future, and I couldn't stand by while those foundations were threatened. In Victoria's worldview, my relationship with Marcus represented an existential threat to the empire she'd built around her family's name and influence. She genuinely believed that love between people from different backgrounds was dangerous enough to justify destroying anyone who challenged her vision of appropriate social arrangements. What exactly do you want from this meeting? Victoria leaned forward slightly, her expression becoming more focused and direct. I want to propose a resolution that serves everyone's interests without causing further damage to any of the parties involved. She reached into a leather portfolio beside her chair and withdrew a document several pages thick. I've had my attorneys prepare an agreement that would address your concerns while providing you with significant compensation for any distress you may have experienced. The document was professionally prepared, with the kind of legal language that transformed bribery into consulting fees and harassment into miscommunication. Victoria was offering me $200,000 in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and releasing all claims against her, her family, and their associated organization. This is substantially more than the amount I mentioned during our previous conversation. Victoria continued, I believe it reflects a more appropriate recognition of your time, your research contributions, and your future potential in fields that might be more suitable to your background and interests. $200,000, enough to eliminate my student debt, fund my living expenses for several years, and provide the financial security I'd never experienced. All I had to do was sign a document, promising never to discuss Victoria's campaign against me and agreeing to end my relationship with Marcus. You're still trying to buy me off, I said. I'm trying to provide you with opportunities that don't require you to spend your life fighting for acceptance in environments that may never fully embrace you. Victoria replied, You're a bright, capable young woman with tremendous potential, but that potential might be better realized in contexts where your background is an asset rather than an obstacle. The offer was tempting in ways I hadn't expected. $200,000 would transform my life, eliminating the financial stress that had shaped every decision I'd made since undergraduate school. It would provide the freedom to pursue research without worrying about fellowship funding or academic politics. It would allow me to build a career without constantly proving myself to people who'd never faced the challenges I'd overcome. But accepting the money would also mean acknowledging that Victoria had been right about my place in her world. It would confirm that love and merit weren't enough to overcome systemic barriers maintained by people with enough wealth and influence to eliminate anyone who threatened their preferred social arrangements. What happens if I refuse? I asked. Victoria's expression hardened slightly, revealing the steel beneath her polished exterior. Then I'm afraid this situation will continue to escalate in ways that benefit no one, she said. The investigations, the media attention, the legal proceedings, all of it will continue until everyone involved has suffered significant damage. You're threatening me, I'm explaining realities, Victoria corrected. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. Media attention is unpredictable and often unfair to everyone involved, even if you ultimately prevail in whatever conflicts arise. The process will consume years of your life and vast amounts of energy that could be better directed toward building your future. She was right, and we both knew. Fighting Victoria's campaign would require sustained effort, extensive resources, and the kind of public exposure that could complicate my career prospects regardless of the outcome. Even winning would mean spending years defined by this conflict rather than my own achievements and aspirations. Consider what you're really fighting for, Victoria continued. A relationship with someone who will always be caught between his family obligations and his personal desires. A career in a field where you'll constantly face skepticism and barriers based on factors beyond your control. A life spent proving yourself to people who may never grant you the recognition you deserve. And what are you fighting for? I asked. Victoria paused, her composure slipping slightly as she processed the question. I'm fighting to protect everything I've built, she said finally. My family's reputation, my son's future. The institutions and relationships that have taken decades to establish. I'm fighting to preserve a way of life that has created opportunities and stability for countless people, a way of life that depends on excluding people like me. A way of life that depends on maintaining standards and expectations that have proven successful over generations, Victoria replied. You may see that as exclusion, but I see it as quality control. Quality control. Victoria had just revealed the core of her worldview, the belief that social and economic hierarchies existed to maintain quality rather than perpetuate privilege. In her mind, excluding people from my background wasn't discrimination. It was maintaining the standards that allowed her class to function effectively. I have something else to offer, I said, reaching into my own portfolio. A different kind of agreement. Victoria looked surprised as I placed a document on the table between us. What is this? A comprehensive settlement of all claims and disputes between us, I replied, but not the kind of settlement you're proposing. Victoria picked up the document, her eyes widening as she read the terms I'd outlined. Instead of accepting payment to disappear, I was offering to drop all regulatory complaints, media campaigns, and legal challenges in exchange for Victoria's complete withdrawal from Portland's philanthropic and academic community. You're asking me to resign from every board position I hold, dissolve the Hawthorne Foundation, and transfer my family's charitable assets to organizations I don't control, she said, her voice tight with disbelief. I'm offering you a way to end this conflict without facing criminal charges for misuse of charitable funds, I replied. The Attorney General's investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic violations of tax-exempt regulation. The IRS review has identified multiple instances of using foundation resources for personal purposes. You're looking at potential prosecution for fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of fiduciary duty. Victoria's face went pale as she absorbed the implications of what I was saying. You're bluffing. Elena Rodriguez's next article will detail the specific criminal statutes you've violated and the penalties you're facing. I continue. The evidence Diana Walsh provided includes financial records, planning documents, and communications that demonstrate intentional misuse of charitable resources for personal vendetta. Diana is a bitter woman who's jealous of everything I've accomplished, Victoria said, but her voice lacked conviction. Diana is a former federal prosecutor who understands exactly what constitutes criminal behavior, I replied. She documented everything because she knew you were crossing legal lines, and wanted to protect herself when the consequences finally arrived. Victoria set down the document, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the reality of her situation. For months she'd been operating under the assumption that her wealth and influence provided immunity from accountability. She'd believed that targeting someone from my background carried no meaningful risks, because I lacked the resources and connections to fight back effectively. What you're proposing would destroy everything I've built, she said quietly. What you've built was constructed on a foundation of excluding and intimidating people who threatened your preferred arrangements, I replied. Maybe it's time to build something different. Victoria stood and walked to the windows, staring out at the city she'd helped shape through decades of influence and manipulation. Portland sprawled below us, a mixture of established wealth and emerging communities, old power structures and new possibilities. You want me to give up everything because you fell in love with my son, she said without turning around. I want you to face consequences for abusing your power to destroy someone whose only crime was challenging your assumptions about who deserves respect and opportunity. This was never about Marcus. This was about you deciding that I didn't belong in your world and using every tool at your disposal to eliminate me. Victoria turned back to face me, her expression cycling through anger, desperation, and finally something resembling defeat. And if I refuse your terms, then you'll spend the next several years defending yourself against criminal charges, while your reputation, your family's business, and your social standing are systematically destroyed by the same kind of media attention you tried to use against me. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of decisions that would reshape both our lives. Victoria had spent months believing she could control the narrative and determine the outcome of our conflict. Now she was discovering that her opponent had resources, allies, and capabilities she'd never anticipated. I need time to consider this, she said finally. You have until tomorrow morning, I replied, standing to leave. The Attorney General's office is expecting a response to their investigation,
and Elena's article is scheduled for publication tomorrow afternoon. After that, your options become much more limited. I walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to face her. Miss Hawthorne, you spent months trying to convince me that I didn't belong in your world. You were right. I don't belong in a world where people use charitable organizations to destroy their personal enemies. I don't belong in a world where wealth and influence provide immunity from accountability. I don't belong in a world where love is considered a threat to social order. Victoria stared at me, her polished facade finally cracking to reveal the fear and desperation beneath. What do you want from me? I want you to understand that some battles cost more than they're worth, I replied. And I want you to remember that the next time you decide someone doesn't belong in your world. I left Victoria's office and took the elevator down to street level, emerging into Portland's late afternoon sunlight with a sense of completion I hadn't expected. The city looked different somehow, less imposing and more welcoming, as if removing Victoria's influence had restored some balance to the urban landscape. Marcus was waiting for me in the lobby, his expression anxious and hopeful. How did it go? She has until tomorrow morning to decide whether she wants to negotiate or face the consequences of everything she's done, I replied. And us? I looked at this man I'd fallen in love with, despite the chaos his family had brought into my life. We have some things to figure out, I said, but we'll figure them out together, without your mother's interference. The next morning brought news that Victoria had accepted my terms. The Hawthorne Foundation would be dissolved, its assets transferred to community organizations focused on affordable housing and economic justice. Victoria would resign from all board positions and withdraw from Portland's philanthropic community. Most importantly, she would publicly acknowledge that her campaign against me had been inappropriate and would not be repeated. Marcus called me that afternoon, with his voice full of amazement and relief. I can't believe she agreed to everything, he said. She's essentially giving up all the power and influence she's spent decades building. She didn't have a choice, I replied. The alternative was criminal prosecution and public disgrace. What happens now? Now we get to find out who we are when we're not fighting your mother, I said, and I get to complete my dissertation research without worrying about institutional harassment. 6 months later, I defended my dissertation to a packed auditorium, presenting research on community-centered development practices that had evolved far beyond my original proposal. The work had been strengthened by my collaboration with community organizations, my understanding of how power operates in urban planning, and my direct experience with institutional corruption. Professor Martinez introduced me as a scholar whose work demonstrated the importance of academic independence and the dangers of allowing external pressure to compromise research integrity. The defense itself was a celebration of intellectual freedom and the value of perspectives that challenge established practices. Victoria kept her word, maintaining complete silence about our conflict and allowing me to build my career without further interference. She disappeared from Portland's public life, reportedly spending her time at the family's vacation home in Bend, far from the social circles she'd once dominated. Marcus and I were married the following spring, in a simple ceremony attended by community organizers, academic colleagues, and the friends who'd supported us through our most difficult challenges. Diana Walsh served as my matron of honor, having become an unexpected ally and friend through our shared experience of confronting Victoria's abuse of power. The Hawthorne Foundation's assets funded affordable housing projects throughout Portland, supporting exactly the kind of community-centered development my research had advocated. The foundation's former board members, freed from Victoria's influence, became champions of inclusive planning practices that prioritized community needs over developer profit. I accepted a position with the city's planning department, where my research on mixed-income development became the foundation for new policies that balanced economic growth with community preservation. The work was challenging and rewarding, supported by colleagues who valued my perspective and expertise without requiring constant justification of my background or qualification. Looking back, I realized that Victoria's campaign against me had ultimately accomplished the opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of eliminating my influence in Portland's development community, she'd forced me to develop skills, relationships, and understanding that made me far more effective than I would have been otherwise. She'd tried to teach me that I didn't belong in her world, but she'd actually taught me something more valuable, that her world needed to change, and that sometimes the people who don't belong in existing systems are exactly the ones who can transform them. The quiet graduate student who'd been overwhelmed by an engagement party had become someone who could challenge institutional power, build coalitions for change, and hold wealthy families accountable for their actions. Victoria had created her own opposition, transforming a potential daughter-in-law into the kind of advocate who could dismantle the very systems she'd spent decades building. In the end, love hadn't conquered all, but it had proven stronger than money, influence, and the kind of systematic cruelty that people like Victoria mistake for strength. Marcus and I had built something real together, something that didn't depend on excluding others or maintaining artificial barriers between communities, and every time I drove past the downtown tower where Victoria had once held court, I remembered that power built on exclusion and intimidation is ultimately fragile, vulnerable to anyone brave enough to fight back with truth, evidence, and the support of people who believe in justice over privilege. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.